My name's Martin Summers, and in the 1990s I worked in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union as an economic advisor for the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development and for the New Economics Foundation.
The crisis in Georgia, South Ossetia, what's the political background in Georgia, between Georgia and Russia, that has led to this conflict?
Well, Georgia was a part of the former Soviet Union, gained independence in the 90s. Just as happened in Yugoslavia, minorities within Georgia were unhappy about being independent from what was then the Russian Federation, and a kind of Cold War, if you like, has taken place between the separatist regions of Ossetia and Abkhazia and the central Georgian government in Tbilisi. And the immediate cause of the fighting, we all understand, was a Georgian attempt to bring South Ossetia under Georgian government control, which then led to Russian intervention. The Russians, of course, must have planned their intervention for several months or years before, but it was the Georgians which actually began the shooting, as far as we know this time. I suspect that this may have something to do with the close links between the Georgian government and the neoconservatives in the United States, who are looking for Russia as an opponent in order to rally their own political forces inside the United States, and certainly that's what President Putin has suggested is the motivation behind the timing of this particular flare-up.
Commentators in the West are now calling Putin an opponent rather than a partner. How do you see this change in perspective?
Well, Putin came to power initially as a somewhat obscure figure in the declining Yeltsin era. In 1998 the Russian ruble collapsed and the Russian economy was on the ropes. It looked very much as if the Communist Party, led by Gennady Zyuganov, was going to win the November 1999 presidential elections in Russia. This created a huge panic amongst the new oligarchy within Russia, and also was not very much welcomed by the Western powers, because it would have been jolly embarrassing from their point of view if, after all the attempts to destroy the Soviet Union, the communists had been re-elected. As it happened, Putin came to power, was named by Yeltsin as his prime minister, and then suddenly a series of unexplained bombings took place, mainly in Moscow but also in Ryazan, which killed hundreds of Russian civilians. The Russian government immediately moved to blame the Chechens and invaded Chechnya, thus initiating another major war with the Chechens. Subsequently, Boris Berezovsky, who was Putin's ally at this time, and his sidekick Litvinenko, both ended up in the West, claiming that in fact it was the FSB and Putin as the head of the FSB which had actually carried out the bombings in Moscow, blamed it on the Chechens, in order to try and win the November election. So this all took place in September 1999, the election took place in November, Putin won with a landslide, the communists were defeated. This is all laid out as allegation in Litvinenko's book Blowing Up Russia, which he managed to write before he was murdered by whoever did murder him in London last year. This is not widely reported in the Western media, but nevertheless it's widely understood that this is very likely to be what has happened. At that stage the West didn't want to mention that Putin might be a false flag terrorist, if you like, because he was their ally at this stage in order to keep out the communists. Later on, Putin has taken a much more independent line. He's become somewhat independent of the oligarchy in Russia, and he's become independent of the West as well. And he's asserting Russia's national interests, or the interests of the ruling elite in Russia. But of course, it's not just the Russians who engage in false flag terrorism. The neoconservatives in the United States know an awful lot about it as well. And the Israelis army was very strongly involved in training the Georgian army. Effectively, the deal between the Western gangsters and the Eastern gangsters has broken down, and that's the real significance of what's happened in Georgia.
Where do you see this going in the near future?
Well, I think that there's clearly a reappraisal going on about the relationship between the Russian oligarchy, if you like, and the Western oligarchy. We're going back to what you might call politics as usual before the Berlin Wall came down, except that Russia is a semi-democracy today, just as the United States is a semi-democracy. I mean, it could be argued that Russian elections are fairer than US elections. It's hard to say. It looks as if both ruling oligarchies have engaged in false flag terrorism against their own people. The Russians in Moscow in 1999, the West on September the 11th. I think that we're in a very dangerous situation, analogous to that before the First World War, except that the people in power now have a much wider array of psychological tricks available to them to bamboozle their publics, and the kind of weaponry that's around is much more destructive than it was in 1914. But people should not be in any way complacent about this situation. The world economy is an incredibly fragile state. This is the kind of period when miscalculations by anybody can lead to catastrophe. We must all be vigilant.